Hey YouTube, this is Archangel for Truth, and my recording for you today is discussing the question, what is the difference between laws and the commands of men? This is a very important question to ask because many people are actually confused as to the difference. And so to deal with this question, I've got a scripture here I'd like to share. It is taken from the book of Matthew, chapter 15, verses, well, we could start it off at verses 7 and go on from there. And what it says is, "You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying these things. These people draw near to me with their mouth, and they honor me with their lips, yet their hearts are far removed from me. It is in vain that they continue to worship me." And the reason why, it says, because they teach as doctrines, as laws, as requirements, the commands of men. Now, that is very profound because many have used Romans. There's a scripture in Romans chapter 13 about showing respect for the authorities, but many have used that as a justification why it is that everything that authority is requiring of you, you should follow. And that is a misinterpretation of what was being said. They also will assume that what that scripture's saying is, or the individual that is speaking in that scripture is that is God speaking. It is not. It's simply the Apostle Paul speaking, giving his own recommendation. So, but here we have Jesus speaking about how man puts ahead the commandments of men, and that these that do so are hypocrites, and that it is in vain that they continue to worship God. And that is really the key here. Now, I've chose this picture here to discuss this topic because as you observe, there is what is called the Ten Commandments. This would have been known to the Jews and Israelites as the law. And so what ended up happening is, and you will read this in the biblical account in the Old Testament, how that law was expanded upon. And that's what Jesus is talking about right here, is they made all their traditions and all these requirements, these commands of men, forcing them upon the people, which that is not something that God had established. And so the difference here is Jesus wasn't going against what was the law. In fact, he said, "I have come to fulfill it." And so that is very important because it makes a distinction between what the commands of men are and the law of God. You see? Now, there are some people that will hear this and will say, well, they don't believe in God, so they don't believe that the scriptures or the things in the Ten Commandments are relevant. or accept that those are things that are laws that are bound upon man, but they are. And there is a consequence, for not following those things, or for the blessing of following those things. And that's what Scripture even says. God says, I put before you the blessing or the malediction, and you must choose the blessing. And so ultimately, what it boils down to is this: what God says is the law. It is something that we all are bound to follow. It is equal for every individual. There's no qualified immunity or this requirement is only good for those that are low in position or station, but the powerful and the rich don't have to adhere to it. No. With God, all men are bound to his laws, and they will be judged according to how they do or do not follow his laws. Now, that being said, we are saved through grace. Yes, that is true. But his laws still are in effect. They never went away. God is the same as he was before. But now let's focus in more so about the commands of men, whether or not these are laws. So, we have governments on this earth that will say, well, this is a law, that's a law, and you are bound to follow that. But is that really a requirement for us to follow? Well, here's the deal. We need to understand how governments operate. Many of us do already know that governments, what they will enforce as being laws, are those things that they are willing to use physical force to require you to follow. And so that is really the key there, is you have men and women who are willing, for the sake of a paycheck, being paid by whether it be the federal government or by the state, are willing to impose upon you the decrees or the commands of men. That is something you need to understand. Because it's really, when it boils down to it, government operates no differently than a gang. So let's say, for example, you go into a specific area, okay, and that area is controlled by a specific gang, and they tell you, you're going to pay us for our protection, and if you don't, we're going to cause harm to you. Well, that's the same thing that law enforcement does. You see, they're willing to use force, they're willing even to kill people, to require them to fulfill whatever they believe to be the law. And that is very important to understand. Jesus understood that there was a difference between the law of God and the commandments of men. Now, I do want to make a point about why it's important to follow the law of God. For example, which is in fact worse? Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. Which is in fact worse? You stealing something from your neighbor, or the fact that you violated the law of God not to steal? Which is worse? Now, many would think, well, taking the item from their neighbor is actually worse. But that would be a wrong conclusion. Because whereas you and your neighbor are equals, God is supreme. And his orders are supreme. And they need to be followed. So the greater harm or crime is actually the fact that you violated the law of God. And I guarantee you, when it comes to being judged on those things, you will be judged based upon whether or not you followed the law of God on that. Now, true, God will also mete justice out, and if you took an item or you caused harm in some fashion, he will mete out justice in a way that is perfectly balanced. See, God is in every aspect balanced in all his ways, and his justice is perfectly balanced with his love, so that his justice does not go so far as not to have love and mercy, but also his mercy and love is also kept in check by his justice as well. So that is a very reassuring thing to understand, that God will never allow an individual that is causing harm or doing bad things to other people. They will eventually be dealt with. And so, really, that is what the laws of God is all about, is justice, righteousness, goodness. And indeed, Jesus told us, you will, by doing these two things, have fulfilled both the law and the prophets. What were those two things? Namely, to love thy God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength and soul, and to love thy neighbor. What does love have to do with fulfilling the law? One might ask. But if you understand that if you love God, if you really love God, then you're not just going to arbitrarily violate those things that he deems to be a requirement from you, whether that be worship or whether it means abstaining from whatever. And so that is your act of love towards God. By loving God, you are motivated not to do those things that is displeasing to him. And the same principle applies to the love of your neighbor. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to harm them. You're not going to steal from them. But rather, you're going to do whatever you can to benefit and help them. That is the love of your neighbor. And so, this is a very simple and easy principle. But you know what? When it boils down to it, as we all are completely aware of, governments assume that what they're saying are laws. They are not laws. There is not one law by man that is in reality a law. It is only the commands of men enforced by violence by those who are willing to accept a payment for the sake of imposing those things upon their brethren. And that is the truth. And that is the truth that governments don't want people to understand. And unfortunately, many, even those who are Christian and those who believe in Scripture, even many of them don't understand it themselves, because there's been an indoctrination into believing that what men tell other men are laws. And so, but we know ultimately there is that distinction between the laws of God and the commandments of men. So, with that, I thank you. If you have any comments or questions, please go ahead. You know, I don't remove people's comments that disagree with me. And if you should, that's perfectly fine. You know, you may do so, you know, as long as it's respectful. But if you do agree, please, by all means, give us a like or a share. I appreciate all of you and your views, regardless if we agree. May God bless you all. So, till the next recording, take care.